In this tutorial, we're going to go over how to use the Form Manager. First, make sure you're logged in as the administrator and go to the admin page. On the admin page, find the Online Forms icon and click it. Now here you can see we have a couple of sample forms that have been predefined with your free trial usually. If you have an older site, you may not have these, but these have been released as templates in our newest sites. So on the admin page, you can see we've got the list of the forms and we've got an edit button and some other functions. First, we're going to go into the options, which are global to the entire forms module. On the options page, we'll start off with the instructions, which is just the text that appears at the top of the page when a person comes in to complete a form. So that's just going to say something like, please choose a form to submit. Custom image is just the image that appears up here in the upper right-hand corner. This is usually a small image, a small icon. You don't want a large image here. Most people just choose default or none if you don't want any. The from field. Okay, the from address for unknown senders. An unknown sender is someone who is not a registered member who submits this form. Normally, if a person is logged in as a member and they submit the form, then the email that is sent with the submitted information is going to be from the user's primary email address from their profile. So if a person logs in, they submit a form, their profile email address will be the sender. It'll be the from address on that form. Let's say you have a public form which allows non-members to submit it. Well, you need to have an address on there. So this is the address you want to have. You can put in something like unknown at I'll put in our address here, hoaspacetutor.com. And that means anyone who is not a member who submits this form, if they could, the email would come from unknown at hoaspacetutor. And that could be anything you want. This doesn't even have to be a valid reply address because you're not going to reply to it usually. You would in the case of a real user, you might want to reply to them about their information they sent you. But this would normally just be anything at your website address. The next field is email field style. When a form is submitted, an email is sent to a person, and we'll discuss who it's sent to when you set up the individual form. The form information, all the text of the form and the fields, the actual input data, is also in the email. You can define how you want the input fields to be displayed in your email. Do you want them to have a border? Do you want them to be underlined? Do you want them to just have a background or have a border and a background? That's just a way of visually setting off the fields that were actually filled in from the text of the form itself. Let's see. So now we have always send form submissions to the unknown sender address. This is not really used that often, but let's say you don't care who is sending each form. You just always want the email to come from this address. Again, it's rarely used, but we did have some webmasters that needed this type of functionality. Maybe they want all their emails that come from this address to be filtered within their email software into a certain folder within their email software. So they always want every form to come from the same address. Again, rarely used. If you don't see a need for it, don't worry about it because you probably don't need it. Include CSV data in submission email. If you're not familiar with CSV formatted data, then you probably don't need to worry about this. But for those who want to be able to take their submitted forms and take the data and extract it into a CSV format for use in a spreadsheet, you can include the CSV data in the email itself. It'll just be tagged at the bottom there, and you'd copy and paste it into your spreadsheet or wherever you're putting it. It's also going to be available for exporting all of the submitted form CSV data at one time. This would be for individual emails. Save a copy of submitted attachments on the server. If the form you're defining allows a user to submit an attachment, a file, with their actual form, then this option, when it's checked, will save a copy of that actual submitted document with a PDF file or an image. It'll save it on the server. So when you go to look at those submitted forms later, you'll be able to see the attachments. It's not required, but it's up to you. Keep in mind, even if you don't check this box, the attachment will still be included with the email that's sent to whoever receives that form's submissions. So if the webmaster is getting a copy of all the forms that are submitted, when he or she gets it, if the person submitted a file attachment, it'll be attached to the email, even if it's not saved on the server. Allow members to view forms they've submitted. Again, this is for non-admin members. So if you have non-admin members who have submitted forms and you want them to be able to go back and look at the forms they submitted, normally you can only view the submitted forms if you're an administrator and you have access to the admin side of this forms application. This allows non-admin members to view the actual forms they submitted. Allow members to view and add comments to forms they have submitted. We'll go over comments later. You can actually have commenting on a form. So when someone submits a form, you as the administrator could go in and add a comment to what they submitted and say, we need to get back to this person on what they requested. And then somebody else might comment as well if they also have access to the forms. So this allows non-administrator members to also view their comments and add comments themselves. Last option is allow non-admin members to delete their own comments. This goes along with the last one. If you're allowing comments and you're allowing these other members to add comments, you may want them to be able to delete their own comments. You may not. Again, this is probably not commonly used, but there may be a case where you say, if a person comments, we want to have that audit trail. We don't want them to go back and delete their comments, so we can always prove what they said later, for some type of reason where you need to be able to see everything they said in the past. So again, rarely used, but it's there if you need it. Those are global. These are all global options for the entire forms application. Let's look at a single form and the options available there. We're going to use the Clubhouse reservation form because it's kind of a standard form and it includes all the different types of fields. So I'll click Edit, and this brings up the form editor page. So we have the title of the form. That's simply what's going to appear on the form listing page. So I'll make it descriptive but brief. Active just means whether this form can be used. If it's not active, it won't appear on the listing. So members can't choose it and submit it. This just hides it. So maybe you're working on it for a while and then you want to make it active when it's ready. The send to field, who will this form be sent to when it's submitted by a user? Who receives the copy of the submitted data? Now this, like all email fields, allows one email address. So don't try to put a comma or a semicolon in a second email address. It won't work. We do get this question a lot. What if I want to send this form to 3 people? And the answer is you can do that by setting up a mail forwarder in Mail Manager. If you go to the Mail Manager on the admin page, you can set up a forwarder. For example, you could call it this form at HOASpacetutor.com or whatever your email address is, whatever your website address is. So then you would put in here this form. And now this form, when the person submits it, it'll be sent to the address this form at HOASpacetutor.com. That address will then forward to whoever you've set it up to forward to, which could be 1, 3, or 10 people. So that's how that works. The after submit URL. This is a web page, an HTTPS : blah, blah, blah address of a web page you want to send the user to after they submit the form. Rather than displaying a message, you want to send them right to a page. So when would you use this? This is not used commonly, but here's one kind of example. Let's say this were, for example, a Clubhouse form that they're going to be submitting. After they submit this form, you want to take them to the Clubhouse page where maybe you display it's a custom page you've created on your website and you want to display a set of rules for using the Clubhouse. You could send them to the Clubhouse rules page and you would get the link to that page and you'd put it in here. So that would be the address of that page. So when they click submit, it sends the email and it immediately takes them to that page and displays that page. Again, it's not commonly used. Mostly after they submit their form, you're just going to want to display a message. That's what this field does. Just type anything you want in here. It can be several lines long. Thank you for your submission. We'll be in touch with you shortly, and so forth and so on. This is the editor. We'll come back to that in a second because that's the biggest part of our discussion. Let's look at the options down here. Display width. How wide do you want this form to be on the page? Default works pretty normally. Default is generally going to be something like what you see here, this size. If you are using one of our newer websites that has this full width format where you see the header goes the full width of the page, our older sites may not have this. They may have a page that the entire website appears within a window that's maybe 3/4 the width of their browser. So for the newer sites that are this wide, you could change this to full width and your form will fill the entire width of the browser. You could do 50%, 75%. This is probably one of those things where after you've designed your form, you can play with it and see how it looks in different widths, and you may decide it looks better at one width or another. Most times forms are just kind of top to bottom, so default works fine. You don't need to have the real large width. Allow file attachments with form submission. This is the button you check if you want the person who's submitting the form to be able to attach a document to it, a file, a PDF or something, or a picture. Send a copy of the form to the submitter. There's a personal preference. If you think this form needs to have a copy that goes to the person who submitted it as well as the person who receives it, this person up here, then you check that box and they'll get a copy as well. Otherwise, it just goes to this person. The person who submitted it doesn't get a copy. Include community name, location, and form title. This can be redundant depending on how your form is set up. You might have the name of your community in your form. But what this does is, if this were a form where the person, like this one, where it just has their name and their address and some information they want to submit, this will always include the community name, the location of the community, which is this field up here. This is the community location. You fill that in setup info. And the form title, which is this field right here. That information will always be added to the very top of the email. And that might be good if you're like a property manager who has multiple communities with multiple custom forms. Each community has a different website and they each have different custom forms. And you want to make sure that you know which community this form is coming from. That might be a good box to check. Otherwise, if this is your only website and you just belong to one community and this is, you won't need this so much because you'll know which community it's coming from. Enable URL spam checking. Text input fields. If your form is public, text input fields can often be a target for spam bots, which are these automated robots that go out and just submit forms to try and spam you. And they often want to send you a URL to the website of whatever they're trying to sell you on. So whether it's legit or not. So what this does is if you enable this, any field on the form that the user when a user submits this form, or when a bot submits this form, if any of the fields contains a URL, HTTP : something, it's going to reject it. It won't let it be submitted. With the idea being that most forms that are going to be submitted by residents won't have a URL to enter anywhere, and most bots will probably want to have a URL in there someplace. Require CAPTCHA. This goes along with spam checking. CAPTCHA is that human verification test. Some people find it annoying. Some people find that there are a lot of bots out there and they want to use CAPTCHA because it helps prevent bots from submitting the form. If this is a public form, you'll see the recommendation over here. If this is going to be a public form where you don't have to be a member to submit it, you probably want this because the bots will find it if it's public. Restrict form to one submission per member. This can be useful depending on if this is the type of form where you want to hear everybody's opinion on something. Kind of like a survey, which would work just as well from a survey. But if you want to hear everybody's opinion on it, and you have several questions, let's say, that doesn't work well with a survey, with different types of input, let's say, you could say, I only want to hear once from each person, so I'm going to restrict this form to only one submission per registered member. If this were a public form, it would have no use because there's no way to verify who submitted it. This goes by who the logged in person is that sent it. Disable enter key on form submission. This one is, again, rarely used. What can happen is a form in a browser, if you're typing in a single field like this, a single line text field, not these fields, these multi-line fields, because you can hit enter in these fields and you can keep hitting enter. Those don't matter. But in a single line text field, if I were to type something and hit enter on my keyboard, it will submit this form. It will act as if I just hit save or apply. So what's happened in the past is sometimes there are users who don't really understand that enter and tab are two different things, and you need to use tab to go from field to field. So some people who maybe aren't familiar with computers, the browser, web forms, may hit enter thinking that's how you move from field to field. And they submit the form after they filled in the first field. So to prevent that, if you have many users that are having that problem, you can check this box, and what will happen is when they hit enter, it won't submit the form. And they'll have to hit tab to move from form to field, and they'll have to click the save button at the bottom in order to submit the form, or tab to the save button and then hit the space bar or the enter key to submit it. But hitting enter inside a regular field like this up here, this would not submit the form. So again, it's not normally used, but it's there if you need it. All right, so now let's get back to the main part of the tutorial and what you need to know about forms and the actual setup. The editor you're probably familiar with by now if you've been doing any work on your website, setting up your home page or creating custom pages. It's like a little word processor. You can enter text that will be formatted. You can set the font. This is the Georgia font. We can set the height of the font to a point size or anything we want. We can bold the font, bold, italics, underline. We can put colors in and so forth. There's alignments and all these other things. You're going to set up your form the way you want it to appear on the page when a person submits it. So you're going to have text that you put on the form, and you're going to have fields. The fields are places that a user either types something into, or a field could just be display only. It's information that the form system fills in for them, but it's not an actual entry field. So what would be an example of that? Well, the name. Here we have name, and then we have what you see here, this tag. We call them field tags. It's where you have a left bracket and then some text and a right bracket at the end. By the way, do not use left and right brackets as part of your form of the text you want to display, because the system will interpret that as a field, and it may reject it as an invalid field. So try not to use brackets anywhere except when you are trying to define a form like this. Okay, so with that said, here's an example of a field that is not an input field. It is a display-only field, and it's username. So what does that mean? That means that when this form is actually displayed on the screen for a person to fill in, this username, this bracket to bracket here, will be replaced with the current user's name, John Smith, from their profile. It's not an input field, it's just displayed. So this also follows for things like their address, their city, state, zip, their phone number. These are just pulled from their profile and they're displayed. These, what you see in brackets here, in curly braces, I should say, these descriptions I'm going to go over later, but just keep in mind that these are a descriptive, short descriptive term for whatever this represents. So this is the address, this is the city, state, zip, this is the phone. It's usually kind of similar. This text in here is usually kind of similar to your prompt that you have on your form, but for now, until we go over it later where it's going to be used, you just want to make sure you have this curly brace and then some description of what this field is, and then ending curly brace. Keep it short, and you'll see why later. And that's always the last thing in this tag. So the tag is always an open bracket, and then the tag itself, which is username, user address, so forth, and then these curly braces with the description, and then the closing bracket. That's always the same format. These are always the last thing to the right of this bracket to bracket tag. All right, so those are kind of boring. There are other ones that are display only fields. If you ever get lost, you can just click this little green icon here. And if you scroll down, here are the profile fields. You just saw we used username, user address. There's a bunch of them. There's user email. There are alternate address and email and so forth and so on. There are other display tags as well. The current date and time you can insert on the form. Your current website URL for some reason if you needed it. And then there are a whole bunch after this that are very unique usage, sequence numbers and things like that, random strings that can be generated on the fly. Unless you have a very specific type of form you're trying to do. One use for something like a sequence ID might be, for example, when people submit this form as a parking spot registration. And so what happens is that you want to give them an ID, someplace you want to have their parking spot ID, even though it's not printed on the ground anywhere. You want this person to say your parking spot number ID is, and you could use the sequence number. And this will just be generated 1, 2, 3, 4 in a sequence, and as people submit them. So it's not tied to anything. It's just the order in which your form was submitted. You're the 10th submitter. Yours will have a sequence ID of 10. Again, these are really not used very often at all, but they're there if you need them. Let's go back to the form. These now we're going to get into the input fields in this section down here. Okay, these fields down here are actual type-in entry fields for the user to fill in. So we're going to ask them for a date. And the bracket tag for this is bracket date, and you'll see :R, and then we've got that descriptive text again, and then the bracket. Okay, so how does this work? Date is a tag that means this field will be a date field. It's going to have a little pop-up calendar, and they can type in, 1/5/2021. Or they can pull the calendar down and see the calendar and pick a date. So what's this :R mean? This :R means this field is required. They need to enter something in this field in order to submit the form. Most of these fields that people type into, as you'll see later, can have a :R at the end. In fact, if we look up here, these different fill-in fields. Text field, that :R at the end means it's required. If you don't include that, which you can omit that. If you omit it, it's just a normal text field. They can fill it in or they can leave it blank. If you put :R, they must fill it in. Okay, the next field down here, time. Well, we don't have a time clock type of field, so we're going to use a text field. Text is just a normal text entry field. The next part of this, the :10, says this is a 10-character field. It will allow up to 10 characters. :R means it is a required field. Okay, so we have a text field of 10 characters maximum. It is required, and then we've got this descriptive text. Expected attendance. Again, we're going to have a text field. It is 3 characters. Don't forget there is a colon in there. It's small, but you can see it. So it's 3 characters long, and it's :R, so it's required. And then here's the little description, guests expected. Will non-members be present? This is a choice field, so this is a different type of field. A choice field looks like this. You've got the choice tag, which tells you what kind of field it is. Then we have a colon. And the colon now begins our options. A choice field is a pull-down selector. It's one of those pull-down fields where you can only choose one of several options and you can't type anything into it. So the options that are going to appear in the pull-down list are listed here. So this says option 1, and then you put a semicolon, and then the next option, and semicolon, and the next option. When you're done with all your options, you can either put the right bracket, because you're done, or if you want to require they choose one of those options, you put :R. If you're going to put :R, you almost have to have an empty option up front. The first option would be nothing with a semicolon to create a blank option. And that way it'll default to the first option, which is blank. And then they have to choose something. It forces them to choose, but it doesn't allow them to accidentally choose the first option. So whenever you use a :R on a choice field, you almost always want to have choice, semicolon, immediately create a blank one, then your next option, semicolon, your next option, semicolon. And then what will happen is the choice field will start off blank, and then all the options are below that. That forces them to choose. But if you're not going to make it required, if it's just a field, again, you might want it blank in case you want to give them the option to not choose. If you don't give them a blank option, then it will always default to the first option. And so that may or may not be desirable. Number field. Number field is an integer range selection. So 1 to 5, you want them to choose. We could have used that for number of guests on this form if we were only allowing up to like 10 guests. So this will be the range parameter is going to be something in the format of 1-5. Again, R required. D is the default value, so we could default it to 3 if we had a range of 1 to 5. A phone number field is a phone number formatted field. We went through date, and then there's others. These results you can even have simple math calculations going on between fields. So somebody enters a number in field 1, a number in field 2. You could have a result field that shows the addition of those two numbers. We've had some forms that do that with adding up amounts of things. A certain almost like a checkout type thing where people have added up prices on things. But again, most of the fields you're going to use are the ones you see here. You're going to have a date field. A text field is the most commonly used one. A choice field is very common. The next field we have here is a notes field. Notes is a multi-line text field. So let's take an example. That is something like this, where a person can enter more than one line of text by either typing and having it wrap around or hitting enter and it goes to a new line. This is a multi-line text field or a notes field. That's what this is. The number for a notes field, the number parameter, is the number of rows that this should show. So 4 would look probably something close to this, 8 would look something more like that, 12 would be something more like that, and so on. And then finally we have a checkbox field. The checkbox field, the second parameter is an N or a Y, and that's a no or a yes. Do you want the box checked by default? When the form is first loaded, should the box be blank? Unchecked, then put an N there for no. If you want the checkbox to have a check mark in it already, put a Y, meaning the user would have to uncheck it. And the R is required. Again, with a checkbox, usually you're not going to have it be required because you're asking them to tell you whether or not they want to maybe they want to use this particular option, whatever it is. Will you bring friends? Check the box. You don't care how many, you just want to know if they're bringing friends. Check the box if yes. So that would be the normal use. It's not required because you want to allow them to have yes or no as an answer. In this particular example, it's a good example of when you'd require it. This is, we're asking them to agree to the terms of using the Clubhouse. So in this case, they have to check the box in order to submit the form. So this allows us, by having a :R, to make this field a required checkbox, meaning they must check it. And that is all of the fields. Those are all of the major fields you're ever going to use on a form for most cases. So this was a good example of getting to see all of those. So that is how the form looks. Now let's go back and take a look at how this form looks when you are a user filling it in. At the bottom of the form is a form link. After you've saved it once, you'll get this form link. And if we click on that, it'll simply open the form up and show it to us so we can run it. I'm going to go in the way the user would go in and go in through the online forms menu option. And this will display our forms. So we have our Clubhouse reservation, which I'm going to click on. And this is what it looks like when you run the form. It's got, remember this username tag? That was, so I am HOA Space Administrator in my profile, so that gets displayed there. It's not an input field, it's just a display only field. Here are the input fields. Oh, and I don't have an address or a phone number in my profile right now, so these are just blank. The input fields, which are the more interesting ones, again, they're required, so you're going to see this little star, little red asterisk displayed here. If you want, as part of your form, you could even add some text that says fields with a red asterisk after them must be filled in. They are required. That might, make it clearer for some people why that asterisk is there. A date field, you click on it, it lets you pick a date. Time, I can put in whatever I want, like 12 p.m. And these aren't validated as a time. I could put in my first name and it would still accept it. So it's just a text field. The expected attendance, this is going to be, again, I can put in 15. And will non-members be present? I'm going to say yes. And the event description is, I'm going to put a birthday party. Last, I have to check the box because it's a required checkbox, and now I can submit it. Okay, I submitted my form, and you can see it's displayed that text that we filled in on the form, that default message that we want to show up after a person submits it. This line is generated by the application because we checked the box that said, please send a copy to the submitter. So I'm the submitter, so it's telling me that I'm going to be receiving a copy at my email address. Now, if you're an administrator, you might want to look at this information. So how do you do that? Well, you can go here. You're going to receive an email, of course, with the form filled in on it in the email. But let's say later on you want to go back and look. So we can go into here and say, let's look at the list of the submissions. Now I've just submitted this. I submitted one yesterday, and here's one from today. And so they are listed in reverse chronological order with the newest ones up top. So if I click on this, it brings up the form data, and it's in an abridged format. It is not showing the actual form with all of the content and all the text. It's just showing the data that was submitted. Now, remember those little curly brace names and descriptions we talked about? In fact, let me go back to that for a second and show that one more time. When we were in the editor, I mentioned them, but we didn't explain where they're used. See this name here? And then we've got address here. All these curly braces that have these descriptions in them, those are being used now on this page to describe each of the fields you're seeing. These are the fill-in fields, or the user, the tags that are automatically filled in. These are all the fields, all the bracket fields on the form. And this is the data, the raw data from that form. These are what was in curly braces. These are the descriptions. So this is why you want to make sure you add them into your form. If you didn't have the curly braces on the actual form edit that we just did, this would say field 1, field 2, field 3, field 4, and so on. This makes it much more readable. So now you can see why you also want to keep them brief, because you don't want this stretching all the way over here. So this lets you very quickly see the information that was submitted, and you can go through the different forms and just look immediately for how many guests maybe you have on each one of these, as opposed to seeing the long form, which might actually require scrolling through everything to find all the information. And if you're trying to look at multiple forms, you just necessarily want to see the data, not all the text that goes with it. Comments. We talked about adding comments. This is the page where you add comments. As an administrator, you can come in here and look at the form and say, well, need to contact this person about their party, and add a comment. Other other administrators who come in will be able to see that. If maybe there are people on the Clubhouse committee, they could come in and see those comments, and they could add their own comments. I contacted the person, everything is fine. And that will just be a stream of comments that will just continue to scroll down in the order they're added. So this lets you have kind of an audit trail of any reviewing or whatever that has to go on with this submission, if there is any. You can also change the status of the submission. If this were something that needed to be acted on, you could say, okay, this has been approved. I've approved of their birthday party, and you can change the status. And that status is shown back here on the submitted forms page over here. So you can quickly see which ones have been processed, closed, need work, whatever the status is that you've selected. And right now you can't control the statuses. These are the only ones that are available. You can't customize them like you can in most apps, but it does give you some ability to classify them at least. Subscribe. Subscribe allows you to subscribe yourself to email notifications about comments added to this particular submission. This does not subscribe you to receive notifications for all submissions to the Clubhouse reservation form. That's different. That, if you want to receive all notifications, remember, that's going to be done back here where this send to is. There's no subscription for this, really. There's no button you can click. This would be whoever's in charge of updating these forms. They would fill in an email address here that, well, let's say it's a forwarder, like we talked about before. This would be a forwarder, and they would go into Mail Manager and add your email address to that forwarder. So now you would be part of the Clubhouse at HOA Space Tutor forwarder, and that would get you a copy of all forms that were submitted for this Clubhouse reservation form. That's how you get a copy of all forms. If we go back to the Manage page, this subscribe button inside the individual submission, this one user submission, this just subscribes you so that you get notified of comment changes being added. So if you're somebody who wants to follow this particular submission, you want to know more about when this birthday party is, what the extra questions were that had to be answered, and there are comments going back and forth between the committee, and you want to know about those items, then you'd subscribe. That's what that does for you. So I think that about does it for all of the parts of the submitted forms, in the listing at least. Attachments will be displayed here, by the way. If there was an attachment, you could click on it and see the attachment. So yeah, that's about it for the submitted part of the form. Let's go back to this one more time. There's a couple more buttons here. One is this CSV button. Again, this is like we said before, if you don't have a need for this, you can ignore it. But if you like to keep external spreadsheets with this data, and you're maybe using that spreadsheet someplace else in some other database or some other application, this lets you export all of the submitted forms that were listed on this page. Every submission for this form will be exported in CSV format, and then you could take that CSV format and include it in some other application if you needed it. This is also a good reason to use those curly brace descriptions like we talked about on the listing, where you see the names of each of the fields. If you have those included on your form, the CSV data will have those descriptions at the top of each column. So if you're familiar with CSV data, it's column, like spreadsheet. It's column based, and at the top of each column will be those curly brace descriptions. So you'll know what each column and each field represents, instead of just seeing the raw data and not knowing what column 5 is. So again, that's a good reason to keep those curly brace descriptions in there. I think that is about it. I hope you found this tutorial helpful. Enjoy setting up some custom forms, and thank you very much for watching.